Hello, and welcome to the Agents for Creative Action staff interview series. I'm Leah. I am a senior art history major, and I'm going to quickly introduce this series, and then we're going to dive right into our interview. So as part of one of the continued projects for the Agents for Creative Action, attempting to keep in touch with the staff at WCMA in this time of social isolation and social distancing, we felt that one of the central parts of the ACA program is to meet with the WCMA staff and learn about what they do in person, and getting to do that at the museum is a really special opportunity. But even though we're deprived of that opportunity during quarantine, we thought that hosting interviews with staff would be a really great way to connect with them and to learn a little bit more about who they are and what they do at the museum and also outside of the museum. So I'm going to pass it on to CJ, one of my co-hosts.
Thanks for that introduction, Leah. Hello, I'm CJ. I'm a senior art history major as well, and I'm also a part of the ACA program. And I'm coming to you live from my very gray bedroom in Long Beach, California. So, woo.
And I'm Victoria. I'm a junior. I'm majoring in economics and statistics, and I am from San Francisco. So there we go. And today we're interviewing Nina. We all had our personal reasons, but I think a really common one was that we wanted to learn more about your creative practices. But yeah, Nina, do you want to introduce yourself?
Happily, I'm so honored to be interviewed by all of you and so delighted to spend time virtually. So I'm Nina. I'm Curator of Programs and Interpretation at the Williams College Museum of Art, and I am calling in from my home in North Adams, Massachusetts, just down the road from the museum. And among many of my various roles at the museum, I have the pleasure of leading the Agents for Creative Action program, which Leah, Victoria, and CJ are part of. So it's really extra special to be talking to you guys in this capacity. I'm not usually on this side of programming, so I'm a little nervous, but very excited to talk with you guys today.
For sure. And so just to start, Nina, do you mind telling us about the work you do at WCMA specifically, and then why it inspires you?
Oh, such a good question. So my role is multifaceted. So I run most of the museum's public programming, which takes many forms. And that includes sort of programs that respond to the museum's exhibitions and collections, but also, and I think we'll talk about this through the interview, a lot of my work I see as really being about bringing people together and bringing people together around art and ideas. So that's really what I see my role at the museum as. And so my title as Curator of Programs and also Interpretation, the other part of what I do, as many of my colleagues do, is to think a lot about how we are connecting with our public. And so the work of interpretation, which, as I always like to say, everyone at the museum is an interpreter, but that role is really thinking about how we tell stories to our public in ways that are relevant and multifaceted and interdisciplinary, and that reflect the issues and topics that are pertinent to us as an institution. So that's usually taking place in our exhibition. So a lot of that work is really done very collaboratively with our exhibition curators in the planning of exhibitions and thinking about the many ways that we're talking to our publics, whether that is through live programming, through tours, through interactive experiences, or even just through the kind of ways that we structure what kinds of ideas we share, or what the kind of framework for talking about the works of art that we're putting on view is. The other thing that I get to do is I get to run the Agents for Creative Agents for Creative Action program. It's a year-long program for undergrads. There's around 12 of you this year that work with me and the museum to create original projects and experiences that engage with the museum's collections, exhibitions, and spaces in new and creative ways. So really what we're doing together, and you guys can probably say much more than I can, but the idea is really to bring students into the role of being active collaborators with the museum and presenting new ways of talking, especially to their peers, about what art can do and be. So those are some of the things that I do.
Yeah, it's great to hear about it. Okay, and then especially during this time, like Leah was mentioning, have you been inspired by anything lately? Like, do you have any creative outlets right now?
Also a great question. I'm inspired by so many things, and I mean now and all the time. I tend to look a lot at, of course I'm inspired by art and by artists. That's a huge part of the work that I get to do, and what I love about my job is actually working with and centering the voices and perspectives of other creative people, and that's something that I'm constantly inspired by. I continue to be inspired by the work that artists do, that museum professionals do, that my amazing colleagues at the museum do, that students do. You all are a huge inspiration for me, and especially in these times where we've been connecting virtually, it's been really nourishing. But I also, as you mentioned, I do have a few other kind of creative practices that I engage with. I am also a poet. I love to write, and that's a big part of the work that what I see is like my whole practice in a way. I've been working on a project with a friend of mine who's a curator of photography who works in another institution, and she's been sending me photographs that are inspiring to her, and I've been writing poems in response, and we have an Instagram project along those lines that we started under quarantine, so that's been a really fun way to connect. It's been interesting because I feel like in some ways this time where we're feeling really isolated, I've been feeling a calling to connect with people even more. And so one of my closest friends and I are doing a kind of like mini seminar together around climate change, and basically looking at the ways that we can talk about climate change through hybrid forms. So we're looking at everything from poli-sci to artists to literary scholars to politicians to scientists to philosophers to religious leaders in really trying to understand what we can about those issues. I just recently was reading a book by the writer Amitav Ghosh called The Great Derangement, which is about kind of an indictment of the arts and its failure in many ways to attend to the representing climate change, particularly in contemporary literature. But I've been really thinking a lot about the way that art can or cannot attend to the really immense issues of our time, one of which like we're in right now. So that's another sort of side project. When you're not in school, it's interesting how you want to still be in school. And I do a lot of collecting also, a lot of spending time in nature. I'm gardening a lot, doing a lot of hiking outside. I've been making my own mineral pigments using rocks that I've been finding on trails that I go to. So really just trying to connect with the world, with nature, with people. And that's, I think, something that I'm always interested in doing in my work as well as in my personal life. So hopefully that's helpful.
Oh, that was a really beautiful answer. And as you were talking, the sense of pulling from so many different sources of inspiration and also kind of looking for connection or forging connection beyond its conventional forms makes me think so much about this holistic kind of dimension or this central holistic quality to what you do, whether it be within the museum or outside of that. I was wondering if you could unpack that some more, specifically in terms of how you kind of approach what you do both as a poet, as a person, and as a professional in very interdisciplinary ways.
That's such a beautiful question, and so generous, I think. I think the question of having a holistic practice is something I've been thinking a lot about, like how to cultivate that and how to draw lines between and through lines, I guess, between my professional work, my creative work, and my life work, my being work. A couple of things I think come to mind. You mentioned interdisciplinarity, and I do think that that's something that I see as part of what I would say is a like holistic practice for me. I'm really believe deeply in the need to look across different disciplines and different sets of ideas rather than being siloed in terms of, you know, approaching the work of care, the work of thinking and being. I think that the questions that we're asking in our time are answered not by one voice alone, but always by community. So I also see very much my work as a work of trying to build community and connections and bring together different ideas from different disciplines, different media, even different approaches to being in the world. And then I think I said the word care, and I think actually that is another really big part of what I see as integral to a kind of holistic practice. If we could say that I have one, I'm not sure that I do, but I would like to hope that I'm always working towards one. But my title being curator of programs and interpretation, the word curate comes from the word for care, meaning to care, one who cares for things. And typically the title of curator is used for those who care for objects. I really see my work in the museum and also in my life as the work of caring for people and for tending to the kind of collaborative spirit of being together and being with ideas and building creativity in a kind of connected and collective way. So that's something that I really see deeply rooted in my own work broadly. And I think there's another, I sent this to a couple of you, but there's a quote by the poet Rainer Maria Rilke in his book, Letters to a Young Poet. He writes about wanting to live the questions, and this idea of living the questions is also something that I feel deeply rooted in, is this idea of like what I like to sometimes call unknowing, or trying to unknow, or think about different ways of knowing, and trying to work against the need for definitive answers, and instead holding the possibility of many things to be true at once, and a kind of openness in that. And that, I think, is a huge part of what I see, the kind of way I like to think about museum interpretation, or the power even of art, or how we talk about art or think about art or teach about art and objects, is to think about the possibilities of many, many things being true at once, that art can hold a multitude of things. And I think it allows us to think of the possibility of multitudes, which I think is really so important in the world and times that we live in. So those are some of the things that I kind of see as like values that are integral to my my practice, which I hope is something that I keep trying to cultivate over time.
Wow, that was really, I mean, that was really something. I keep, like, especially in the latter part of what you were saying, I kept thinking of that Walt Whitman quote, like, I contain multitudes, and thinking about how we can possibly use that, or use that kind of framework as a model for conceiving of the object, not simply as something already formed or purely formal, but something that's always forming, and that never fully amounts to what it can be, right? That always places it within the realm of possibility. And with that, I hear you talking about this openness with which you connect both care and creativity, but it's in a way where you often kind of give it out to others, where others are able to receive it. But I'm wondering how that relationship kind of manifests itself in your own life, and specifically why these notions of care and creativity are necessary for you, both during this time of extreme isolation, but also as a kind of larger philosophy.
Another beautiful question. Thank you, CJ. Wow, that's amazing. I guess I think that, I mean, for me personally, I see, I guess, care and creativity as a way of processing, of working through, of forging, I guess, these kinds of openings and the way that we can think. And in fact, like, I think imagine other possibilities. So I guess, like, I see creativity as a way of trying to imagine that there might be other possibilities that we haven't explored yet, that there are other ways of being. And I do think that relates very closely to care, because right now we need, and we've always needed, as human beings, ways of thinking about and thinking towards new possibilities. And I think right now we need to think about new possibilities that afford greater care, whether that's care for each other, whether that's care for our communities, whether that's care for our environment, whether that's care for the future, for the past, for those who are more vulnerable than us. I really think that the work of artists and creative practitioners broadly is right now, and I think needs to be, the work of posing questions and challenging us to think about what else is possible and what other ways forward we have afforded to us as a culture, as individuals. And I think that there's the work of questioning also, right? Like and challenging. That's something that I see the power of art and creativity as being deeply rooted in. The idea of also critique. This is, I think, something maybe also that's relevant to how I see my practice. And my work is also thinking very much about, not only, I mean, as someone who does public programs, like what is public, the work is not only about looking outwards, but often about looking inwards. And I'm thinking especially about conversations about, like, the field of museums and what museums and art institutions and academia can be with the legacies that they come from, right? And that we have to attend to those histories and dig into those histories really thoughtfully and, I think, critically, in order to move forward. And we also, as museum practitioners, as creative practitioners, also have to think deeply, not only about the publics who receive the art, but those who are making the work, the workers, the people who aren't coming, the people who aren't in the museums. And so there's a sort of reciprocal, I think, relationship between the outward work and also what I see as the inner work. And I guess maybe that's where I see care as being something that is a practice of, and even a creative practice of, tending to those who are outside, but also having to tend also to the inside, to look inwards, whether that's institutionally or individually. I don't know if that sounds so abstract. I hope that's helpful.
Nina, thank you so much for your beautiful response. So you mentioned, this idea of unknowing or rethinking knowing. And I think that sort of idea is very pertinent to what we're experiencing right now as being all sort of locked up in our homes in quarantine. And as a current senior, soon to be grad, I've been thinking a lot about the uncertainty and the sort of definite unknowing about the future of the art world amidst the pandemic, the economic crisis that we're facing. And you graduated shortly after the recession of 2008. And so I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about your experience graduating sort of at a very similar feeling time as right now, and how that informed your career path or job decision making.
Oh, that's a great question. You guys have such great questions. I'm so grateful for you guys. And it is really, I really hear and feel that for both of you, CJ and Leah, and for so many of the students who I know and work with and who are part of the museum community and the Williams College community. It's such a hard time to be embarking on going out into the world. And yeah, I did graduate sort of a couple years sort of after the recession, but I think that the thing that your question points to and what is true is that even a couple of years after the recession hit, the effects of that were still really felt. And so it wasn't like, it was for a number of years, I think that in the arts, the impact of budget cuts and of just pulling back and the need to pull back was felt, right? And I certainly felt that as a young person trying to forge my way towards a career in the arts. When I graduated from college, I moved back home with my parents. So that was something that I did right away. I got a job in New York City after searching for a little while and having actually difficulty finding a job in the nonprofit sector of the arts, which was where I wanted to be. And so I took a job at a commercial art gallery, which was not for me ultimately. But what I will say is that one thing I think that happened that maybe my trajectory was impacted was that I decided to go back to grad school sooner than I think I would have planned to initially. I had always planned to take a few years off between finishing undergrad and going to grad school. And I was thinking about getting a PhD. I ended up getting my master's at Williams, which actually is, I think in many ways how I'm here in the path and trajectory I am at now. But one of the things that was true for me as well was that I was not someone who had the financial support or ability to just go live anywhere, work for really low pay, and be supported by my family. I was supported by my family. I was able to live home, which was extremely fortunate. But, even in applying for graduate school, I was not going to be able to take on any debt any more debt. So that was really important for me to have a funding at an institution. And that and I'm really happy to be very transparent about but that was why I went and did my master's at Williams, was because I had funding. And that is kind of rare, can be rare in the field of master's degrees. But I think that was really important for me, and like really shaped my trajectory. I went where there was funding, essentially. And I think that's something that's really important to talk about in the arts. And I think the other thing I want to say is that precarity and vulnerability is not something that only exists in the arts, only in these moments of crisis. It exists often. And there are so many people who work in the arts who are underpaid and who are paid, there's a lack of equity, there's a lack of inclusion, and the work of inclusion and even the pathways into this work are not always inclusive and equitable. And so I think that work of really thinking about how we are attending to that, and we're seeing the effects of that. We see in these moments of incredible crisis and devastation, we see how vulnerable and precarious this field can be, and we see that it's often people who are already less advantaged than others who are the most vulnerable in these institutions. And I'm thinking about frontline staff. I'm thinking about, and CJ, you mentioned this, I mean, the impact of this crisis, and this has been true before, on like freelance educators, right? And just even education departments, right? So, you know, I think that's something that also shaped my way of thinking about museums and institutions, was sort of entering the field in a moment of crisis and sort of seeing what that meant for friends of mine, you know, people trying to enter the field, and how unequal the field was and how it continues to be. And that I think that there's also so much work to be done and to continue to do to work against that and work towards a state where the arts are more sustainable, they're more equitable, they're more inclusive. And that, I think, is a huge part of this work of care. How do we as institutions care for our workers, just as we care for our publics, just as we care for our objects?
Thank you so much, Nina. I feel really grateful to hear your thoughts on that. I think you bring up a lot of really important, pertinent issues. So my next and final question for you is, how do you see your future curatorial practices shifting in light of this current crisis that we're facing?
Oh, you guys, such good questions. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I've been thinking so much about this. And I would say I've been struggling a lot, actually, as a curator of public programs, and someone who I see my work so much about in-person experience. Like, that has been something that I've always felt really core to my work and practice, is about the actual bringing people together. As I said, bringing people together around art and ideas. And for me, something about the digital, that this whole new world where everything we're doing is digital, it just feels really insufficient for me. And I want to, like, I'm saying that very vulnerably, but I'm really working right now on trying to think about what it means for me to develop authentic programming that feels true to my work and my practice, and the work of teaching and engaging deeply and thoughtfully with works of art and with the work of artists and the work of people and thinkers in this virtual format. So I think that is something, I mean, I think we're going to see also, but a lot change, and like things change permanently in light of the moment that we're in. I think that there are some really exciting things that can come out of this time also. I do think, like, to my last sort of commentary about museums and precarity and vulnerability, I do think that this might be a time where museums do have to kind of wake up to the challenges that that they're facing now, and attend to them differently. And again, that's sort of this possibility of opening up new pathways and ways of being. I'm hopeful that we might see bigger structural change, and at every level, but also in the arts and in museums, that looks to more equitable and inclusive and sustainable futures in light of this. I think, though, that there's also the possibility of greater access, that some of the lessons we're learning right now in terms of as we navigate the digital realm as museum practitioners and programmers, that accessibility of material will be more thoughtfully tackled and cared for. One of the things I've been thinking a lot about is how we can create public programming experiences in the virtual realm that are multivalent, and that also, like, attend, for example, to the reality that a lot of people are home with their families and might be home with children, or you know, and how do we reach them, and how might we make that material that we're sharing relevant to an intergenerational audience. At the same time, there's the reality that the digital is not accessible for everyone. So how do we also grapple with that? And I think I haven't seen a whole lot of that work develop yet, but we're just entering into this realm. It's such a great question, Leah. And I think the other thing I can imagine in terms of my work changing, you know, is a kind of recalibration of what it means for art and museums to be public, what publicness looks like, and I think also what programming looks like. I've been thinking a lot about intimacy in this time, and how we're often, you know, in homes or spaces that are kind of closed off, where we're not connected physically with large groups of people necessarily, although everyone's spaces and homes are different. But, you know, what does it mean to experience art and creativity and ideas in just such a different format, where you might be more physically solitary than you might be in a crowded museum. But I think that a huge part of the work that we do as museum practitioners is really about that individual connection with works of art. And so I've been thinking, like, a lot about that and what is still possible in that realm. But also, I think I'm also coming to that in a line of questioning too, of, well, we think a lot about the individual connection with the work of art, the aura of the work of art, seeing an object, you know, standing in front of a masterpiece and taking it in as, like, the kind of mythos of the museum. But also, that's very individual. And I also think that we need to think about how museums and institutions are also attending more generously and thoughtfully to the collective, and not only to collective experience of art objects, but also to the issues that our communities are really working through. So I also think that what the work is, I think, is changing, and I think will continue to change, but I'm really hopeful that it's going to keep changing in really positive and continuously more inclusive and equitable ways. I hope that answers that.
Thank you so much, Nina.
Thank you.
I think I can speak for all of us when I say I really enjoyed hearing all of your thoughtful responses. CJ, I'm not sure if you want to add anything quickly before we wrap up.
I echo that sentiment fully.
You guys, I'm so grateful to chat in this way. I hope some of these thoughts are helpful and generative to you. And yeah, the questions are so beautiful and thoughtful, and, like, are making me think new ways about my work and sort of where I am right now. So I really thank you. I truly, there's such thoughtful questions, and there's such critical and important questions for all, I think, of us as emerging professionals and museum professionals, creative professionals to think about in these times. So kudos to you guys for such thoughtful and incisive questions.